Since then, security changes that are independent of COVID have taken place. So it's best to look at the website, the Fermilab website, in order to see what the current standards are. They do change based on rates of COVID and things like that. But you do need a picture ID currently. Next year, you will need a real ID in order to access the lab. So habitat of Fermilab is pretty diverse. The lab itself is 6,800 acres. We have about 2,600 acres of land that we manage at some level or another, 2,000 acres of agriculture. So you can see on the left side of the screen, we have prairie, woodland, savanna, shrubland, and grassland communities. This is a pretty unique area. The lab itself was established from Weston, Illinois, which is no longer in existence in the late 60s. And the first lab director, Dr. Robert Wilson, wanted to have some kind of land management occur on the site. And Dr. Robert Betts had heard about this. He was a professor at Northeastern University, and they had a meeting and decided that they should be working and restoring prairie. I'll show some aerials in a little bit, but it started in 1975. So we're going on 45 years of prairie right now, of restoration. So it's some of the longer prairie restoration, or the longest prairie restorations in the Midwest for sure. They started with 70 species, and they're all collected locally within 50-mile radius. And then in total, over a period of like 25 years, about 1,000 acres of prairie was restored. So these pictures are some of the early. We use a combine in order to harvest seed. This is a couple combines ago. We have local seed harvests with the public. This is Dr. Betts standing up in the corner. So his nickname was Mr. Prairie. He's very influential for restorations in the Chicago region for saving remnant prairies, but also for Fermilab. So it's always been, the restoration and management of the natural areas have always been invited the public in to help out. So there's an organization that started called Fermilab Natural Areas in 2006. And since then, they have been a volunteer program. They're a nonprofit organization. That's how Glenn and Dennis are both able to monitor birds on site. So they have stewards, wildlife monitors. They monitor plants of concern. They have workday events, and we're in the process of trying to get those reestablished. They historically were every Monday and Wednesday. It's going to be a little bit more sporadic than that this time around. Annual seed harvests, which are still wait and see. We have to figure that out as we get there. They do provide interns, typically 1 summer and 2 fall interns. And then they also obtained a grant for some special projects. And we'll go into those special projects in just a few minutes. But they're critical to the success of the natural areas. So full-time staff, I'm the only full-time ecologist on site. And then we have a couple part-time people, one of which just retired. So it's 2,600 acres for a couple people, and some help from our roads and grounds group. We need as much help as we can get. Fermilab is also a national environmental research park. We are a single-use lab, so everything is related to physics, which makes sense, right? But it was designated in 1989, I believe, as a national environmental research park. It's one of 7 in the country. Other labs allow, so these are all national labs that have this designation. Other labs have this and are able to conduct research on their own. We don't do that. We actually invite other people to come in and conduct research. So research can vary anything from maybe a bumblebee survey, or actually that's how I believe the bird monitoring started, was actually under a National Environmental Research Park project, and actually FNA as well. But then also argon, for instance, these are both pictures of argon. They're looking at biofuels with switchgrass. They're also looking at methane interactions in agriculture fields versus prairie, to see what the differences are in our, or carbon dioxide, sorry, not methane. They're looking at expanding to methane, but but looking at carbon dioxide interactions with the soil and air. So this is before Fermilab. This was a 1939 aerial, and this is actually the main ring. So fast forward to today, and this is what it looks like. So it's a lot of restoration, natural areas that were not previously existing. It was just all agriculture field. We have another area. So this is one of the areas. I should mention the main ring is not actually open to the public. It's just a really drastic view. This is Atomic Energy AEC and Lake Law, and then also the shrubland area, which both are open to the public, or all those areas are open to the public. So this is what it looked like in 1939, and this is what it looks like today. A lot more habitat, a lot more diverse. So for some of our special projects that we've had, originally there, so as you, on Batavia Road on the west side of the site, this is AEC. There's a lot of cattails that it established, and we're looking, I think Dennis and Glenn and the other bird monitors that had discussed that maybe if we could draw the water levels down in the fall, we could get some shorebirds that come in. So we cut some experimental cattail cuts, so you can see those through here, and just to see how it would react. So the idea is that you drown the cattails and remove them, and then you get these mud flats during the fall migration. But what happened was they started observing some least bitterns and other species that are uncommon. So they decided, or as a group decided, this is before my time here, that we should cut more cattail cuts. So now you can see by the fall of the same year of 2018, there's all of these cuts in here. And for a few years, it worked pretty well. We had some really wet Mays. So we were going to try and maintain it that way. And then basically the cattails drowned. Still, so we had altered our goal, but then in the long run, it's still pretty decent shorebird habitat. And then the cattails are likely regrow in some dry years. So we'll try and get back to that habitat. So that was one of our projects. In the long run, it's still I think a pretty decent success. So our next project that FNA is Fermilab Natural Areas has received grant for is Eola grasslands. So this is actually an aerial. You can see, I'm not sure which ones the cut strips are. We cut about 150 to 200 foot wide strips and then left unmowed, and then mowed, unmowed, all the way down to try and manage brush. So these areas are becoming overgrown with brush, and we're trying to look at mechanical ways to manage that, and then also increase nesting habitat. So this side is basically just frequent mowing. And then on the east side, we're rotational burning. So we burn 1/3 each year to see which one the birds respond to. But Fermilab Natural Areas has received some grants for that work. And that is in year 2 or year 3 at this point in time. And then our next project is the sparrow hedge, which they're going to talk a lot more detail on. This is what it looked like in 2002. You can see shrub clumps and a lot of open space, good for shrubland birds. And now you can see it's really dense in a lot of areas. There's still some decent areas in this kind of region here, but you look at the southern end and there's just no diversity, no good habitat for shrubland birds. So we're working on a plan to try and restore that habitat and get shrubland birds back. So at this point, I'll stop sharing my screen and Dennis can start sharing yours.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Just a couple comments about what Wally just covered. One of the main target species that we're going for, which is a real long shot, but traditionally we had upland sandpipers nesting in those grasslands the north section of Eola Road. And what we're trying to do is recreate a more diverse structure in those areas. So it's a matter of getting all the brush out for sure. But then we're also hoping with the approach of doing that mowing that we will create some diversity in structure with taller and shorter structure in certain areas. And the upland sandpipers are a species that would utilize all of those areas in their breeding cycle, but for different activities, they need areas that have those different structures. So that's what we're trying to accomplish there. But now to what I'm supposed to talk about this evening is where you can go when you do come out birding. And so the map that Fermilab supplies to any visitors is this map right here. And we basically now have a corridor where we can enter on the east here on Batavia Road, and it goes the whole length of Fermilab, and the other entrance is here off of Kirk Road at Pine Street. And I think Wally was suggesting, this is probably the main entry point to use, just because it's a lot easier to find that access point. If you do know your way around this area, this is Route 59 here, and so you'd have to turn in on Batavia Road, but there's not really any major signage indicating that you're heading towards Fermilab until you actually get to this point. So I think that's why Wally is suggesting coming in from the west end. But at any rate, we do have this corridor. And if any of you have visited Fermilab before, if you've birded at Fermilab, you need to get into your mindset that the areas for access have changed. They've changed considerably. And they may change again and improve, and give us more opportunities to get into birding more places. But I'm going to talk only about the areas that we do have access to. And then on occasion, I'll be pointing out old areas that people at one time visited, but they're no longer allowed to get into those areas, just so that we're clear on where we should be doing our birding. And that's important because I think Wally mentioned that, this is a DOE site. And in the entire country, this is the only DOE site that allows the public on site. And so we need to recognize that as a privilege, that we can get out on this site and go birding. And if I think if we're caught misbehaving too many times, we would put that in jeopardy. And I don't think anyone wants to do that. So do pay attention to what I'm talking about tonight as far as where our access is. So I'm actually going to start on the east end. And it's one of my favorite areas to do a lot of birding at Fermilab. So I want to start on that end. And there is a trail system that wraps around in the lakes area here. So we're going to talk about that in some detail. As we continue west and as we pass the buffalo fields, which are in this area right here, that's another area where we can at least stop off and we can scan those fields. And as we continue on through the site, we actually have an opportunity to bird on the north side of Pine Street, which would be up into these trail areas here. This is a large woodland here, and then these are tall grass prairies here, and then moving into scrubland up here. And then we can also head on the south side, and that's where the Letterman Education Center is, and there is a little bit of trail access there too. But we'll talk about all that in a little more detail as I move through these slides. So as far as the habitat that would be available in the lakes area, we have a variety of things going on. We have some grasslands, we have scrublands, oak hickory woodlands, some wetlands with cattail edges that come and go. And then we have large bodies of water, and hopefully, at least in drought years, we do get potential mudflats, and they can be very good if we have the right kind of conditions. We do get those droughts. So those would be the kinds of habitats we'd be getting into, and there's a lot of seasonal potential in here. All year round we can find things. But let's get started by coming in off of the main road here through the lab, and we're going to end up parking in this area here right next to Lake Law. There's a big red barn right here, and you can park on either side of that barn. But the first trailhead that you're going to see takes you up onto a berm, and you can now scan all of Lake Law, which is this large lake here. And that trail proceeds around on a berm and traverses a variety of grassland areas and scrubland areas all the way through here. This is an area that traditionally we've called the sparrow hedge, and a lot of great finds have taken place in this area. But if you're continuing on a loop, you would continue back behind AEC on the south end. We have another small lake on this side of the trail, which is called the Sea of Evanescence. It can be very productive for shorebirds. And then we're going to proceed back around this way, and you're back to the road and you can walk the road. So in making that loop, there's a couple of things to point out. There's a lot of opportunity for waterfowl in wintertime if the water is open in any of these areas. This berm area here is probably the best area on site in the wintertime, at least in accessible areas that you could find snow buntings or longspurs. They do show up along here on occasion. And in the spring, we'll still have lingering waterfowl. We get warblers. There's a very nice woodlot that occurs right here We've had on rare occasions, some gangbuster days in those woods. And in the summer, scrublands would be a main target area, which would be in this area here. And late summer, potential mudflats for shorebirds, depending on water levels in these two lakes. There's been times where we've had extreme drought and you could almost walk all the way across Lake Law, and certainly you could walk across AEC. So as the water levels are going down and we're getting those mudflats, it can be a great place for shorebirds. We've had some incredible shorebirds show up here. We've had piping plover on, trying to think what lake it was on. I think that was on Lake Law, if I'm not mistaken. We also had red phalarope here. So we have had some incredible species out here. In the fall, continuing with shorebirds, and then warbler and sparrow migration. And the edges along here and in the backside here, those are probably currently the best places on site where you can get some of the better sparrows like LeContes and hens, Nelsons. I have had LeContes right here at the very start of the trail. This is like a great, very wet, grassy area. We do get sedge wrens in here, and we do get, as I mentioned, I have had LeConte sparrows there. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit more here on some areas you shouldn't be going into. So we can park here, but you're in an area that we call the village, and all of that is off limits at this point. Any of you that have come out to Fermilab and birded in the long past, there's a big pine lot here that used to be a great place to go looking for long-eared owls. We haven't had long-eared owls in there in a long time. They've been pretty much driven out by the public. But these areas are all inaccessible now. That's all closed off. You shouldn't be birding in those areas. So sticking to this trail system is the main thing. And this trail does split twice. So what's shown here is probably the easternmost trail, but there's another trail that kind of parallels Lake Law and actually swings a little bit around the south end of Lake Law. And then there's a trail that divides the entire area in half. There's a trail that's not shown here that will actually connect. It runs along the sparrow hedge fence row and comes all the way here, and you can complete a loop going that way as well. The sparrow hedge is quite obvious. It's an area that has a lot of shrubs in a wall. There is a trail that also indicates where you're at. And once you get on the other side of that, this is all ag. And I think maybe you remember that from the aerial that Wally showed. This is all ag out here. So if you're into ag areas, you've gone too far. If you do make this entire loop and you decide to walk on the road, you can stop in this area here and also have views of AEC to the south and Dusaf Pond to the north. And I'll point out that we do have ospreys nesting all over the site now. We're having great successes with that. None of them are accessible. All of those are in off limits areas. However, from this point here where these two lakes meet, if you do look to the north, you'll see the tower that the osprey are on. That's nest number 2. And I think Glenn's going to go into a lot more detail about our osprey successes, but that's the only one that you can view, and you can only view it from this point. You are not supposed to be walking up this road here or along this lake here, which traditionally people used to do that. And that again is an area that's off limits. So as we make our way through the corridor, we're now hitting the bison fields. So there are a couple pull-offs on the north side of the road. And those are places that you could go looking for some of our more interesting birds in the winter, as well as some vagrants that show up in spring and late summer. We do get on occasion cattle egrets out here in these fields. We do get upland sandpiper visiting. Not sure what population they're coming from, but it would be more or less post-breeding wandering that's going on there. And one of the biggest things that you can do, concentrating on these areas, maybe in the latter part of the morning or in the afternoon when all of the geese are starting to congregate. There are days where you can get all 5 of our geese in those fields. So that'd be Canada goose, cackling, snow, Rosses, and greater white-fronted. We always get excited when we can get a 5 goose day. It happens on rare occasions. So now we're going to continue even further west, and we're getting to probably one of the major complexes of trails that we have access to. There is one parking area that you can utilize. It's on the western or the northern half of Pine Street. So the westbound portion of Pine Street. In this area, Pine is actually split. So there is parking right here. That's going to give you access to some tall grass prairie areas that are out here. There are connectors that will allow you to get into the big woods. And there's a large trail that wraps around through here, and there are lots of opportunities, for woodland species in here, both in the spring and summer. Lots of opportunities for mosquitoes as well. And you can also use the tallgrass prairie trails as connectors out to an area that's outside of our circle that we can't see, but way up in here, there are areas that would get you into a scrubland area. So those are all great places to bird. You can spend a lot of time in there. A lot of good species. And then perhaps Glenn will go into a little more detail on that. So our last place that we can do a little bit of birding would be on the southern portion of Pine Street, or the eastbound portion of Pine Street. And that's going to get you into the Letterman Science Center or Education Center. And when you get into that site, you have access to their parking. And along that parking area, there are usually some bird feeders that are being maintained. And that would be a great place to visit in the wintertime. We do get some good birds on occasion there. And there's also a small trail that takes off from that parking lot and brings you towards Wilson's Hall. And it's going to cross over this little creek that's right here. And so that can be a very good area for birding in the migration months. It's a good place to get a few warblers, things like that. So probably our biggest claim to fame in this particular area was a fall yellow-crowned night heron that hung around along this edge for a while, and many people got to see that with great looks. We don't get very many records of yellow-crowned night herons in DuPage County anymore. They were much more frequent when I started birding, but we even have a much harder time finding black-crowned night herons these days, let alone yellow-crowns. So that's my take on where you should be birding. Do try to stay in those areas that are the correct areas to be birding in. As I mentioned, it is a privilege to be able to bird at Fermilab, and I certainly missed it over the last 2 years. We're finally back in. I would hate to see us disappear again. So by all means, if you're unsure on where you should be birding, ask somebody. There's certainly plenty of signage up as far as what roads not to go on. So you should definitely adhere to that signage. And if it says you can't drive on that road, you also can't walk on that road. So those areas are completely closed off, unfortunately. But as time goes on, maybe the conditions will change and we'll have greater access, and we can maybe get back to where we were several years ago. So Glenn, you want to take it away?
All right. I did see in the chat that somebody asked about the old dog training area, which was on the southeast corner of Batavia Road and Eola Road. And that area is also no longer available for public access.
Thanks, Glenn.
So I want to share with you just a little bit about the Fermilab bird survey and some highlights from that program. The Fermilab bird survey was established in 1987. It's a 35-year-old survey. It's one of the longest continual running surveys of its kind. It's an occurrence survey that documents what bird species are on site on a week-to-week basis. And so months are divided into quarters rather than actual like true weeks. And that's just for consistency's sake in the data collection, because weeks can be broken up in weird ways over time. The survey is broken down into 5-year periods. So the first period was 1987 to 1991. All the data for an individual species recorded in a 5-year period is combined to create that species bar chart. The bar charts have been a fantastic tool available to bird watchers for decades now. They've been up on the Fermilab bird website long before even eBird was around, and eBird had its bar chart tools. These are great tools, though. They are a great visual tool that helps us to look at the species occurrence over time. And so in the case of this pied-billed grebe, we can see that it's it's a breeding species, which is represented by that solid bar through June, July, and August. You could see how Each month is broken up into those quarters, especially, a great example of that, look at July. You could see how it's been, Greaves been seen 1 week, but maybe not another week. On these bar charts, red is the oldest period. So red is the 87 to 91, and then it goes up chronologically and chromatically. The really neat thing about these bar charts is they allow us to look at trends that have occurred over the past 35 years. So some additional notes on the bar charts. There are several birds at Fermilab that are year-round residents. Those species typically have a solid bar throughout the entire year. There's actually 12 species that have been documented on every quarter month during every period, which is pretty impressive. That takes a lot of work on the bird monitors parts to do that. Most of the bird monitors efforts, though, are placed in actually recording the different species of bird on site during every quarter month. So the bird monitors go out, and instead of targeting specific birds, they're targeting habitats and trying to get a good sense of everything that's in there. And therefore, that allows us to know all of the birds that are occurring on site at any given week. That being said, in the last 2 years of each period, the bird monitors, we generally do start making it a goal to fill in the gaps. So you could see here the first week of February, we needed a song sparrow. Well, we missed that bird that year. So it's always a bummer when you miss an otherwise expected bird, but we do target some species in the later years of a period in order to fill their occurrence on site. So Fermilab is home to 90 or over 90 species of breeding birds. Those birds, they occur pretty much in every ecosystem on the site. So everything from our wetlands and our grasslands and the woodlands and the shrublands, and even the built up developed areas of the site have specific species that breed there. And even the agriculture fields have specific birds that breed in those areas. So when you look at some of those bar charts, again, breeding birds typically are indicated by a solid bar, June, July, and August, such as, on this eastern kingbird here. When you're looking at the bar chart, you'll notice that other birds have only just started nesting on the site in the past 5 or 10 years. And that's certainly the case with the sandhill crane. It's a more recent breeding bird. And then there are other species such as the upland sandpiper, which used to occur on site as a breeding bird, had breeding bird status. However, that status, they're no longer breeding status at Fermilab. And so if you take the time to look through some of the bar charts, you'll be able to get a really good sense of what these breeding birds are at Fermilab. And yeah, I'd like to share with you a couple other breeding birds that I think you might find interesting. So probably Fermilab's most famous breeding birds are the 3 pairs of osprey on site. So all of the osprey nests, like Dennis said, are in non-public areas of the lab. Only the nest 2 site, which is on Dusaf Pond or up by Nepesi Marsh, is viewable from Batavia Road. However, none of these nests, you can't really get very close to it just as a member of the public. That being said, you can very often find the adults fishing on most of the lab's lakes. and even offsite at the nearby forest preserves, or even as far as the Fox River, they'll forage out to. So one really incredible note is that Fermilab's Nest One is, by all accounts from our research and what we know, Illinois' most prolific osprey nest in the post-DDT era. So more or less since the 1970s, there's not been a more prolific nest. And that is just indicated by how many young have fledged from that nest. So since 2009, 33 young have fledged from Nest One. And then since 2013, Nest Two has fledged 12 young, and Nest Three fledged 11 young in the last 6 years. And so it's incredible that just in the past 13 years, these 3 pairs of osprey have contributed 56 young osprey to the population. So continuing looking at some other breeding birds that may be of interest to bird watchers, the Bell's Vireo. There's usually 2 to 3 pairs that nest annually in the sparrow hedge area. These birds are well established, although they've kind of plateaued in their population in there. We typically don't see more than 2 or 3 pairs. The grasshopper sparrow is a species that is unfortunately on a decline at Fermilab. The bison pasture has typically been a good place to find them. And on years after we've done a burn in the spring, the interpretive trails on the west side of the site, the prairies out there, have also hosted grasshopper sparrows. So yeah, it's like with a lot of anticipation that the management of the Eola Road grasslands will better support the grasshopper sparrows, and the management plan for the sparrow hedge will hopefully continue to support the Bell's Vireo. Some more breeding birds. You could pretty much find Henslow sparrows and bobolinks in any prairie ecosystem on site. Henslow sparrows especially have had an astonishing recovery at Fermilab. So starting in the year 2000, they began nesting on site, and that was after over 2 decades of not even being observed on site. And so it's incredible that just in the last 20 years, Henslow sparrows are now, I would argue to say, a common enough occurrence at Fermilab that you could probably find them in most prairie ecosystems. Moving over to our oak savanna ecosystems, bluebirds and red-headed woodpeckers are both breeding birds. The red-headed woodpeckers, unfortunately, have been on a decline over the past really 2 decades. Looking at their bar chart, you could even see that we have difficulty finding them in most months. The bluebirds, on the other hand, have actually maintained their population at Fermilab, and that's probably with the help of many bluebird boxes that have been placed throughout the lab. So if you're visiting the bison pastures, the bison farm area has a number of bluebird boxes along its perimeter fence. And a couple more just interesting, fun breeding birds. The hornlark, they're regular year-round residents, and they usually breed along the edges of the agriculture fields to the north, but they can often be found along roadsides, and especially in the winter, they're usually very conspicuous and out in the open. Blue grosbeak is a really interesting breeding bird. It's one of the more recently added breeding birds to the site. So there have been 1 to 2 pairs that have nested sporadically throughout the scrublands and that tree planting area on the west side of the big woods. That being said, since I think 2018, we haven't seen any breeding success for the blue grosbeak. So fingers crossed that they keep coming back and they have success again. What's really interesting though is we didn't see blue grosbeak at Fermilab until 2012. It's a species that has been slowly expanding northward and it found Fermilab. Last breeding birds I'll share with you. Fermilab has always been a great place to find kestrels. There's anywhere from 4 to 6 pairs of kestrel that nest on site on any given year. The most publicly accessible or easy to see kestrels are going to be the ones at there's a nest box on the corner of Eola and Batavia Road. And they're usually very active hunting in the fields over there. That being said, I've also found kestrels using natural cavities on site. So that's really exciting. And then the last bird is another new breeding bird on site, the bald eagle. In 2019, a pair of bald eagles took residency at the site and successfully fledged 2 young. Since then, they've not had success, but they are still on site. So fingers crossed that they have success moving forward as well. When you think about it though, that's a lot of big fishing raptors all competing for food and space between 3 pairs of osprey and a pair of bald eagle. So I would like to share just a few highlight birds from each season. The short-eared owl and the northern harrier are winter highlights that have always drawn bird watchers in. Typically, Eola Road has been a great spot for bird watchers to see them. Do take note though that Eola Road is no longer a public access road. And so you may be able to park at the old dog training parking lot and use your binoculars or scope to view from there, but you can't actually drive up Eola Road anymore to look for short-eared owls. As Dennis said, the berm along Lake Lawn AEC, as well as some of the roadsides, are great for looking for Lapland longspurs and snow buntings. A lot of folks come out to Fermilab to look for those birds. And then of course, the waterfowl. And so some of the magic of Fermilab is that there's pretty much always at least a little bit of open water on site. And that's been the case since the Tevatron was built, as warm water is pumped out of the ring, and that warm water keeps many of the lakes open and free of ice. And so there's a lot of diving ducks that will either overwinter at Fermilab or are spring and fall visitors. And also, as Dennis mentioned earlier, we have had a number of instances of 5 goose days visiting the Village Lakes area and the bison pastures. A great way to pick up those geese mixed in with all the Canada geese. Spring highlights, we get plenty of warblers. We may not be Elson's Hill, but Fermilab still has a lot of great spots for you to go look for songbirds. Rusty blackbirds are also regular spring visitors to the site. They're often found in the channel and the creek in the big woods area, or along Owl's Nest Woods where it meets the AEC. Really quick, just speaking of those warblers, we've actually had 35 species of warbler documented on site over the past 35 years, and 28 of those are perennial visitors. And then other great spring migrants that we get are the thrushes, pretty much all of the expected flycatchers and vireos stop at the site. And we get a lot of great shorebirds that stop at the site as well. Pretty much all of the expected Northern Illinois interior shorebirds are expected at Fermilab as long as the water conditions are good for them. And that typically means lower water conditions, specifically on AEC and Lake Law. Some fall highlights. Well, fall migration starts early at Fermilab in July, in late July with shorebirds. So there's so many great shorebirds that have been documented on site and on the bird survey. Stilt sandpipers and barred sandpipers in August and September, and long-billed dowitchers running into October, as well as dunlins. You know, these are expected shorebirds that you can find at Fermilab on an annual basis. And then there's been all sorts of great vagrant shorebirds as well that have been documented on site, from western sandpipers to avocets, and all three phalaropes are have been vagrant visitors to the site. In the fall, all of those warblers, they make their return trip, and many of them stop off at Fermilab. Cape May warbler is a great example of a warbler that, at least I think, is a little easier to find in the fall. We tend to find them more in the fall than we do in the spring. And of course, the sparrow hedge has its namesake, all of the sparrows. It's filled with sparrows. So again, all of the usual cast like fox sparrows, white crowned sparrows, Lincoln sparrows, juncos are all found in there. And as Dennis pointed out, the edge of AEC, especially in low water years, is a great place to look for LeConte sparrows and Nelson sparrows. Really that first week of October tends to be the week to look that you want to go look for them. And then I just put together a list of some of my favorite vagrant birds over the past few years. There's been a number of great scoter observations. All three scoter species have been found at Fermilab, and that's fun in the winter. Sometimes it's a challenge to look through every goose and duck out on those bodies of water, but it can really pay off. Again, there's been a number of great shorebirds. Avocets a few years back were really a treat. We recently found a deceased yellow rail on the site. They're at Fermilab, so that's pretty exciting. That just means that folks have to head out to AEC and walk around in the edges of those wetlands and kind of flooded out short grass areas to see if they can find a yellow rail perhaps. There's been some great gull sightings over the years. My last new bird at Fermilab was a glaucous gull the day before the lab shut down due to the pandemic. And then there's great raptors that stop over at the site. We've had a couple young goshawks over the past few years. And then there's always a bunch of other fun birds like the scissor-tailed flycatcher in 2015, the mountain bluebird from a few years back. And one of those gangbuster days in Owl's Nest Woods produced a prairie warbler. So really quick, just looking at the bird survey, there's been all sorts of great trends so that we've been able to pool from the survey. So looking at dabbling ducks, for example, they've been arriving later and later in the fall, and in many cases, they're overwintering. We could probably attribute this to mild winters that have occurred in the past 2 periods, and therefore waterfowl are arriving later and they're staying longer as long as there's, enough open water for them. Another trend is looking at shorebirds with truncated migration windows. And so, that dowitcher really is a really telling species, how they used to be on site for a very long period of time. And now, we only catch them a few weeks. You could see on average how it's pinching. And then warblers, most species of warblers are arriving on average 2 weeks later in the spring than they did 20 years ago. And across the board, most of the warbler species are showing that trend. The spring and fall migration is also becoming shorter because the warblers are not adjusting their departure with their later arrivals. So again, we're seeing later arrivals and a more truncated period in which we're seeing those birds on site. So these are just some of the trends that we've uncovered through the Fermilab bird survey over the past 35 years. With the survey, Dennis and I are both very glad to be back out on site and collecting data again, because this has been a very valuable survey that has, pulled some really incredible data. And again, the trends are very evident when you look at these bar charts at what's going on. And so we're glad to be able to be on site and continue this, this work. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Dennis.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm just going to make a couple comments about the surveys that's been going on for 35 years. When you do look at those bar charts and you do see a gap, those gaps are very, very significant, especially when you're talking about a bird that we're really pursuing, such that I'm going to use red-headed woodpecker as an example. So we're really trying hard to find that. And so when you end up with a gap for that species, it's significant, because it's not that we just didn't find that bird 1 year. We did not find that bird for 5 years in that week period. And of course, as Glenn mentioned, as we get further and further into that 5-year period, get to year 4 and 5, we're trying very hard to fill all those gaps. So it's very significant when you see a gap. Like if you look at, I see Glenn threw up the screen with the eastern bluebird, and you can see that in mid-February, there's a gap there, and you see another one in mid-November. Well, that's kind of unusual. We'd expect to see it all year round, but this means we missed that bird 5 years in a row in that week. So that's very significant. And then all of us together collectively have failed to mention that there are 292 species of birds that have been seen at Fermilab. And that prairie warbler that Glenn had up there a minute ago, that was 291. And number 292 was a pileated woodpecker that was reported by Wally. So we even let Wally do a little birding every now and then. So with that, I think we should open it up for questions all across the board, and we'll try to help you out if we possibly can. I've been trying to answer a couple of them as they were coming up during our speaking parts. There's a couple of them I left for Wally to address. In particular, there seems to be a lot of questions about the dog park area that is now closed. And you can go to the parking lot. I think that's allowed, but you're not allowed to walk into the fields from there. And Wally, do you want to elaborate on why that is? Because somebody did ask the question, why all the restrictions?
Restrictions have changed. I mean, that's just a Department of Energy stance. I along with anyone else probably aren't in any of those meetings, so we don't know the exact reasoning. Just changes in stances by the Department of Energy, and those change over time. Either allow more access or less access. That access has changed in the past. It's not the first time.
There are groups that have not been welcomed back. So I'd like to point that out. The dog park people, I'm not sure what the story is there, but they have not been invited back yet. Fishermen have not been invited back. A while back, we had a horse group that used to ride horses out there all the time. They were kicked off the site. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a DOE site. It's the only one in the country that we have access to as a public. And so it's a privilege to be there. So rather than questioning why we can't do things, right now, after not being out there for 2 years, I'm happy I can go anywhere out there. So that's my 2 cents on that. I can say that, Wally probably can't say it quite that way.
Hey everyone, I would just like to quickly also insert, while we're waiting for you guys to put in your questions in the chat or even unmute yourself, I would just like to also say thank you to our speakers. If we can get a huge round of virtual applause, just once again, thank you guys for doing this program.
All right, well, we can go through some of the questions. Marilyn asks, are yellow-headed blackbirds breeding at Fermilab? The short answer is no.
Yeah, I did respond to that one through the chat, and I'll say that for everybody that missed it. We have very, very few records of yellow-headed blackbird on site at all. I want to say it's probably less than 5 records over those 35 years. And overall in DuPage County, they've become quite a rarity. And the last time I was reviewing the checklist for the latest edition of that, I was tempted to actually drop yellow-headed blackbird from the DuPage County checklist. So it's just hanging on by a thread. We have about 10 years to go out and find some yellow-headed blackbird, so I don't cut it from the checklist next time around.
Let's see here. When the ospreys fledge, do they stay in the area? So initially they'll stay in the area for a few weeks to maybe even a month, but their parents kind of, once those birds fledge, they boogie out and they just tend to leave the young to fend for themselves. And so the young will hang around Fermilab for a little while, but eventually they'll leave. We have our suspicions that nest 2 and nest 3 may be offspring from nest 1, but there's really no way to actually confirm that without, doing some kind of like DNA analysis.
Nest 1 has enjoyed a lot of success. It's never been preyed upon, where we've had difficulties with that on nest 2, and mysterious things have also happened with nest 3 that we're not sure of.
Yeah.
We suspect that maybe eagles were a culprit in some cases, but I'll also mention that nest 1 showed up all on its own entirely. All of a sudden, boom, we had sticks being piled up on a electric pole. Nest 2 was actually a platform that was designed for birds of prey, and it was put on the opposite end of the lab. That's the one that you can see from Batavia Road. And so that was a platform that was erected, and then it was utilized that very fall. Birds showed up there and started making some preliminary nesting arrangements up there. And then nest 3 has a very, very checkered past, and I'm not even going to go into all the places that thing has moved around, but that pair has finally settled on a spot, but they've gone through a lot of difficulty. They haven't given up on it, and they are now producing young as well.
Yeah.
But that was another one that just showed up on its own. We didn't do anything to encourage them, other than the fine work that Wally is doing with all the restoration on site.
Of course.
He's, I think he's adding fish to all the ponds all the time.
I gotta say, I think Glenn mentioned it earlier, but it's absolutely bananas that you've got 4 major fish-eating eagles effectively in one site. I mean, I know it's a big site, but that's still crazy cool.
Yeah.
It's just in a perfect place, I think. And, eagles and ospreys both are making a big comeback. DuPage County has at least 4 nests that I'm aware of now. So that's a species that, as Glenn mentioned, it wasn't that long ago we didn't have either species in the area for a period of 60 years or something like that.
Yeah.
The proximity to the Fox River, I think, helps out a lot too. When you see the young birds leave, we live along the Fox River, and we see them pretty frequently in the fall. So they're not just using Fermilab, they're using, that the river system and local forest preserves as well.
Yeah. I mean, just barely past a mile down the road, there's another osprey nest at Warrenville Grove Forest Preserve. So, that area, it's not that it's just Fermi that, I mean, don't get me wrong, Fermi is very magical, but there's also, you have the whole Blackwell Lakes complex in Herrick, you have the Fox River just a few miles west of the lab. And so, as Wally said, I mean, there's so much territory and so many different sources for food and for fishing that I think it's just kind of the perfect spot. And with the lab being kind of like a little oasis and, being a little bit more quiet and the birds not having to deal with, as much traffic as they would in some other areas, I think it's a nice little reserve for them. It's actually a very big reserve.
I see a question about avian flu. To my knowledge, there's been nothing recorded on site at this point. So far it's good.
Is access at dawn or at 8 a.m.?
I believe it's at dawn. I believe it's at sunrise. So a little bit after. But whatever's on the access is what it's.
It does say sunrise to sunset now, where, it used to be 8 o'clock. So you can look at that as a plus. We are able to get in a lot earlier now. It used to be that all the monitors could go in and bird and have a great time, and then everyone else played catch up and came in at 8 o'clock. So now you can get in there the same time as the weekend.
Yeah, but certainly if you come out here, check the link to the webpage that I sent just to make sure. Because I know Kane County just went from low transmission rate to medium transmission rate for COVID. So that has actually changed some of the access requirements for subcontractors and things like that. And also, if you're a visitor to the public, now you have to either have a basically say that you have a vaccine, or you have to have a negative test to enter the education center. You have to either sign your life away or at least show that you had a negative test in the past 72 hours to go inside a public space. Outdoors is fine. It's just if you go indoors. So that was a change as of, I think, Friday.
I'll also say if you're heading out to Fermi and you're meeting friends and you have like an established time that you're meeting with them, give yourself a few minutes to get into the lab, because it is a little bit more of a process now. It's not just like it was back in the day where you just flash your ID and they let you in. They actually, it's a process. They take your ID, they look stuff up, they give you a visitor's pass. So make sure you give yourself a little bit of time.